In past episodes of the podcast and in Catholic Founders Guild discussions, I have brought up the term multiple times, Ecclesiastical Ventures, and today we are breaking down what that actually means with Mark Wilson, the founder of Nicodemus Ventures. Welcome back to the Catholic Founders Podcast. If you are new here, our goal is to create an army of Catholic business owners who are dedicated to carrying out God's will in the world. We use this podcast as a way to meet Catholic business owners and to learn how they have implemented or are implementing their faith into how they run their businesses so that we can imitate them. The goal is for this to be as tactical and tangible as possible. So in other words, we're always focused on action over theory. So get out your notepad and figure out what way you're going to change your business or life today to make this happen. As noted, we are speaking with Mark Wilson. Mark is somebody who stumbled upon the term ecclesiastical ventures during his time living in Italy, but he ended up following this curiosity and became kind of very deeply researched on the topic of what exactly an ecclesiastical venture is or was, especially at the time. So today, he's breaking down what an ecclesiastical venture is, sometimes also called an ecclesiastical enterprise, how it functions, what characterizes it, the spiritual and earthly benefits of one, and how we can start making these a reality once again. One thing before we start, if you enjoy this show, please give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast player. Consider it a little bit of almsgiving for the value that you get out of the podcast. And if you're feeling extra generous, please share the show on social media or directly with some of your friends. Now, if you haven't already, I do also recommend checking out The Saintly CEO, which is our free weekly newsletter that comes out every single Monday and gives you a little bit of advice on how to run your business more like a saint. It's completely free, so sign up today. All right, enjoy the show. All right, Mark, welcome to the Catholic Founders Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I am very well. I just got back from the Sense Summit yesterday and feeling very blessed to be surrounded by, at least for the week, so many other Catholic entrepreneurs. There's a lot of really cool things happening. We'll be talking about that in the pod soon, but I'm just feeling very, very grateful for all the things that God is doing in the world right now through entrepreneurship. So give us a lot of people may not be familiar with who you are. So could you just give us a quick introduction to yourself and kind of what you're working on today? And then from there, we're going to talk about Ecclesiastical Ventures.
Sure. Well, I'm trained as an architect, but I worked in real estate development for years, kind of in my formative years as an architect. Then I expatriated, went to the University of Florence in Italy. I lived there for most of the time between 82 and 92 and got involved in product, industrial design, yacht design, and then began developing, kind of inventing and developing some products and the entrepreneurial skills that I learned from real estate development kind of applied to also developing a product, and repatriated after investors decided to support a project. And that kind of leads us to this work that I'm doing in regenerating the ecclesiastical enterprises or ventures, and more specifically what that is, defining it as consecrated religious corporations that began in Florence, Italy, because I consecrated my first business and myself, and that started leading me down this path. And then I discovered that, you're not in good shape if you're kind of trying to wing it. And then I learned that there were those that had done it in the past in a fairly strict way, and its impact resulted in the establishment of Christendom.
So for people listening, I have brought up this term ecclesiastical ventures multiple times on the podcast in reference to what Mark has told me. And also we've talked about it in our paid membership group chat. Sometimes we'll talk about it as kind of like the guiding principle on how to be a good Catholic entrepreneur. But how did you originally discover that this was a thing? Because when you told me, when I heard your talk on another podcast about this, I was like, that's super fascinating. Like, where did you dig this up, in what history book?
Well, like I was saying, I stumbled into it because I had worked in corporate America for 12 years already. And I used to think that people that didn't succeed at whatever they were focused on was because they were lazy or stupid or ill-equipped or whatever. You work hard and you're driven and you know what you're doing. You achieve the goal. Well, when I consecrated myself in this product that I had developed, I saw everything change. I did everything right, all the steps for some particular goal, and it failed. And then in other instances, I did everything wrong. It was clear there's no way this should work out incredibly well. And people say, wow, you're a genius. So, I'm scratching my head saying, wow, there's something going on here that's different than anything that's ever happened in my life and work. And of course, I made the connection to the fact that I did this consecration. So in effect, when you dedicate it to God or you surrender it to Him, He's in charge. And I've learned that you can abandon it, right? You can abandon this commitment. It's not like a vow. But it's a very serious commitment, but you can't undo it. You've given it over to God. Now he's in charge. When I started my first company, the first investor was a priest. There were 11 other priests that invested and a bunch of other people. And so I had good spiritual direction, and I began to experience things I never experienced before. And I noticed the critical importance of a prayer foundation, right? And that if I eased back on prayer, the carpet started to move underneath me. And if the spiritual director got deployed to a foreign country as a military chaplain, that was devastating too. So this led me to begin to investigate, others who had done this. And in essence, the Irish did that. And that's how Ireland was converted so quickly. And I could tell you more about that if you like. There's not a ton of documentation on that, but when it comes to the consecrated religious corporations that we refer to as ecclesiastical ventures or enterprises, one's a little different than the other. A venture I think of as those where it's a real risky kind of entrepreneurial thing. And we are called to take risks as Christians, prudent risks, right? But risk nonetheless. I mean, that's really what you're doing when you're stepping out in faith. So because I'd been in Florence and for so many years and was traveling back and forth even after we came back, we were living like 5 minutes from the archives. So you could go to the archives and you could get records of those businesses from 800 years ago. You could get the tax records from people 1,000 years ago. And that started to lead me to understand that, hey, this was being done in Florence, and here's what specifically was being done. And I'll be short so we can kind of stay focused on things you'd like to know. Is that what happened in Florence was very well documented. And so the laity approached the Franciscans when they first showed up, and this is when the Franciscans first started, very, very, very beginning. And they were hated by everybody because there was upward mobility like never before in history. The Florentines invented the corporation about 40 years earlier. So now these serfs are now the merchant class, and they're making money and they're doing well. And this guy comes along and says, embrace poverty. What are you, nuts? And the church didn't like it either.
Are you a Catholic business owner trying to bring in more leads? Launching a podcast might be the best move that you haven't made yet. St. Colby Studios helps Catholic entrepreneurs launch professional, mission-aligned podcasts that build trust and increase leads. Their team walks with you through every step of the way, from strategy and recording to branding and editing, so you can launch your podcast in under 90 days. And because you're a Catholic Founder listener, you'll get 20% off all services for the remainder of 2025. Just mention the show when you reach out. 158 million people listen to podcasts every month, and that's just in the US. Your ideal customer may already be listening to a competitor's podcast. Visit stcolbystudios.com to schedule your free consultation today. Thank you, St. Colby Studios, for sponsoring this episode of Catholic Founders.
So there was a small group, and the small group said, hey, will you give us a rule to live by? And the friars go to Assisi, talk to Francis, and he says, sure. So that's how the third order got started. And so they operated their businesses doing the full divine office, not an abbreviated like they do today, morning prayer, evening prayer, and that's kind of, no, they're getting up at 1 a.m, 5 a.m, all the minor hours, everything. And their goal was not profit. Their goal was not success. Their goal was the salvation of its founders, managers, and employees. That was the purpose of work. Of course, they wanted to, feed their families, pay bills. In fact, in the research that I've done, especially, and this is thanks to medievalists in Italy that I've been in touch with on a constant basis, every day I get some feed of some documentation, is just how similar life was in Florence 800 years ago compared to today. So if a dozen companies 800 years ago then become 60, become 250, and they flip a pagan city, not city like New York, but it was a city, it was pretty big, and it was, controlled by secularist pagans, They flipped it and it became Catholic controlled in about 5 to 7 years. And the reason this occurred is because these companies were focused on being faithful, not focused on being successful. And this can be replicated today. And what it does is it's recognizing that God is in charge, and every day you're focusing on recognizing that and growing in virtue, not trying to apply techniques and use Catholic teaching where you're using it but still controlling it. And that's what's going on. And as far as we know, every Catholic business program and every Catholic university that business program that's going on, they're good. They're very good, but they're not talking about surrendering over, and saying, okay, we have a patron saint, we have a spiritual director for this corporation, we have a prayer regimen, and the prayer regimen is adhered to above everything else, no matter what's going on. They're knocking on the doors, bankruptcy is looming. You don't quit on the prayers. And that's where God comes in and saves things at the last minute. And if you look at the lives of Padre Pio and the building of the hospital, or Maximilian Kolbe in the publishing business, or more recently, Mother Angelica with EWTN, they got saved at the last second many times. But what they accomplished is so extraordinary. And what did they have as a business background?
Nothing.
Like zero, nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a really good point. I think this is a good context. So you just in general, I want to make sure we touch on a couple of those points and you can clarify. So when you say this is 800 years ago, so roughly what was this time that this really began, and how long do you understand that it lasted, that these ecclesiastical ventures were really?
That's a great question. And I know people say that all the time. That's a great question, but no, it really is. And here's why. Okay, so it started about 1220, okay, and then around 1224, I think that's 3 or 4, that's when they were given, the third order was formed. They were given a rule, and of course, because life was so similar to today, there were those that hated the church in Florence, Italy, and the same characters that are active today with the same motivations. So they were being fought. In fact, intellectual property, patent law, was developed in Florence because of all the betrayals and infiltrators of these wildly successful ecclesiastical enterprises or ventures. Secular counterparts or companies that were doing similar business, they couldn't compete. And of course, that made them very, very angry. But what happened was, because the quality of life was so great and all people of goodwill could join these companies, right? There were tons of conversions. That's how the conversions were occurring. They were occurring because the faith was caught, not taught, and it was done in the most practical, logical way. A person of goodwill is living in this company, their quality of life is going up. And so other husbands and wives with kids are saying, the wife tells the husband, why don't you quit that stupid company you're working for, where, we're miserable, the kids aren't happy, it's not a really good environment for you. Why don't you see if you can go work for that, Franciscan company, and that happened. So to your point, it was probably about 100 years that it really kind of exploded, right? Maybe 100. And it generated all of the wealth of the Renaissance, that golden age, as Archbishop Chaput said, that never was. That was the age of decadence, right? Now, the attacks were building all the time. And then, of course, the grandchildren didn't have the faith of the grandparents. And that's another common phenomena, right? And then with the French Revolution, they basically destroyed them all, outlawed them, killed many of the spiritual directors and founders, took all their assets, and then they rewrote history about what the guilds were. And they don't even mention the consecrated religious corporations. They always talk about the guilds, but the guilds were not originally Catholic either. The guilds wound up being taken over by the Catholics, and that's why they had, like the Medici had the Blessed Mother as their patron saint, and so on and so forth with the various.
Got it. Yeah, that's really helpful, because I'm always curious with these things. I think, some people are critical when people talk about these past ages that were, but it's actually very common if you study history relatively. You don't even have to be that much of a historian to see that there were things that were done for periods of time that just kind of went out of style because of the victors rewrite history or whatnot. Sometimes things just go out of style and they forget about them, right? We won't get into other examples of that right now, but I want to focus right now on, can we talk about, maybe before I ask about examples, what is at the core of the ecclesiastical venture, just to make sure people really understand this? Because you mentioned it earlier that it's not about achieving financial outcomes. What is their primary objective with organizing this, group of people to build
The
something?
primary objective is salvation. Life is short. So where do you want your eternal soul to go? And that's really what they were focused on, and worshiping God and living a penitent lifestyle. So that was the focus of the Franciscans. You got a question?
Yeah, I
Go
was gonna
ahead.
say, and why organize around a company, right? So if their focus is salvation, what was
Because you're
the
working all day. You're spending what? Most of your waking hours working.
got it?
How could you possibly pray that much, right? How could you possibly, like today, this is why, like in the 1800s, was it Pope Leo, I think, that said, okay, well, now whichever mendicant orders, they started reducing the prayer obligations because people just couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. And in fact, there's one third order Franciscan, one Franciscan Third Order. I think they're great, but they're not growing. And the reason they're not growing is they want to see people do like most of the prayers, right?
So mainly they
And
because
only a
of this.
retired person can do that. And a great Franciscan, if I can give a shout out to the Marian Friars Minor, Friar Anthony, their founder, is very practical. He gives people options, but his desire is for people to be able to pray more. So if you wake up in the morning and you go to a company and they've got a chapel and you're a faithful Catholic, well, that's an easy way to go to Mass. And then it's ora et labora, and then you do morning prayer and you work, and you do mid-morning prayer and you work, so the major and minor hours. And it's effortless because it's baked right into the company, right? And if it's not, there's no way that there can be this amount of prayer and praising God and allowing him to kind of drive everything that's going on and direct everything that's going on.
If you're listening to this, chances are very high that you are a Catholic business owner or are planning to become one soon. So if you'd like to be part of a group of others just like you who are striving to build successful, profitable businesses while also striving for sainthood, consider joining the Catholic Founders Guild today. It's $10 a month or $100 a year, so anybody can afford it. To get started, just go to our Substack and click Upgrade to Paid today to get started. All right, back to the show. Yeah. It's just a very interesting perspective because you order things in the proper order and then kind of the rest of it takes care of itself. Because most people would say, and we come up with this with entrepreneurs a lot, where they're like, I'm just too busy. I can't make it to daily mass. Like there's too much going on. And that's kind of like the whole point of being an entrepreneur, my point of being your own business owner as a Catholic is I can choose those things. I can choose, to spend time with my family, to go to daily mass, to have my prayer routine. So in general, just to make sure I've got this right. So this was really kind of in opposition to the lack of focus for the faith, right? Other companies that you would work for, like you were not treated well. You were kind of, especially in that time, I assume, kind of almost like slavery, right? It's very, very hard labor, and there's not going to be a lot of time to put your prayer in. So
Yeah, and
these
not so
companies
different from
encounter.
today, where faithful Catholics are being canceled, or they're being forced to wear some T-shirt they don't want to wear, or participate in what. I mean, it's another form of slavery. I knew people that kind of escaped from the Eastern Bloc, and they came here and they're working for a corporation. They're saying, well, they're really controlling my life. The
Yeah.
corporation is. And so here there's a great deal of freedom. Another extraordinary thing is there was never creativity the way there was in that period of time as a result of people working in this way. One of the essentials is to be in a state of grace, right? So many business programs, university business programs, and other Catholic business initiatives, they don't talk about that. They don't want to get personal, right? They don't want to, but the reality is that's really what is the critical factor. When you show up at an ecclesiastical venture enterprise and you're working for one every day, you should be growing, becoming more holy. The environment is one in which you're sanctifying yourself and others and your work. And everyone is keeping everyone else accountable in a sense. I mean, for an example, let's say there's some homeschooling kid who's 11 years old and it's an ecclesiastical venture that's manufacturing something, and they're on the floor sweeping or doing whatever, and they see some behavior or they're treated in a certain way. They don't have to have this confrontational thing. Maybe they could talk with the person and get it resolved. But in many instances, things can't be resolved in this way. But because there is a spiritual director for the founder, who's the spiritual director for the ecclesiastical enterprise and venture, and the managers have to have spiritual directors, it's very easy for someone within the company to speak with one of them and say, listen, I don't think I was treated fairly. And the spiritual director might investigate and say, well, actually, and they might correct the employee, and then the employee will be grateful because they want to grow in holiness. In another instance, it might be that 10-year-old who points out something, and then the spiritual director in charity speaks to the CEO or the manager that offended the child, and the manager or CEO goes, Father, you're right. I'll speak with him and I'll apologize. And so there's an environment that one priest told me doesn't even exist when a priest is falsely accused or something happens and he goes before the tribunal or the bishop. They're kind of on their own. They don't have kind of the built-in system that exists with an ecclesiastical venture or enterprise, which is seeking the truth and defending the truth.
Yeah, that's a very interesting mechanism of keeping things going because you have constantly in any company, people have their own issues or the things that they're not so good at, and if you have this first of all sense of we're trying to get to heaven, and that means purifying our hearts as much as possible and living in virtue, then you have this shared motive, and then you could become more open to feedback, and
Exactly.
when you are improving, the company's improving too. So quick interruption. Big shout out to Verso Jobs for sponsoring this show. Joe and the team at Verso Jobs have built an incredible company that helps Catholic founders hire people who are actually aligned with your mission. They have built this incredible gamified and data-driven platform that helps you hire people who actually share your mission and values. And the best part is, it's built by Catholics. So whether you're hiring for your startup, school, parish, or nonprofit, Verso makes it easy to find mission-aligned talent that's ready to build the kingdom. Just visit versojobs.com to get started. That's Verso, VERSO jobs.com. To the heights. Let's talk about this. So, do you have any from your research? Do you have any core like big examples of what was a result? Kind of, I'm talking about physical buildings being built, things of that nature. Like any major results
Perfect
that came
question.
out
Great
of
question.
these ecclesiastical ventures.
Practically everything you see in Florence, Italy, that everybody raves about, because here's the way that it worked. You had these consecrated religious for-profit corporations, but now you've got founders and managers that are only taking in salaries what they need. So imagine if in today's terms, somebody founds a manufacturing company, the product, there's global demand for it. It's $1 billion company. And the founder, who is an empty nester, is taking a $90,000 salary. The VP of sales, who is 38 and has 8 kids, he's taking a $175,000 salary. And salaries get worked out with the spiritual directors. Okay. So to answer your question, so now all this wealth is produced. So then they're interested in the salvation of souls. They form the confraternities. So the confraternities were born out of this. And now they're doing charitable works, building hospitals, building schools, all sorts of charitable organizations. And this also accounted for all sorts of conversions because that never happened before. And people of goodwill that usually constitute about 80% of any given population, they just can't help but recognize the love from these, at that time they were Franciscans, and then Dominicans very quickly followed. There's no ignoring it. So it went from the corporations, the confraternities, and then taking over the guilds. But it was the confraternities that's like building stuff left and right. And also talking about building, that was how the Franciscans in that 100-year period carpeted Europe. I mean, they went everywhere. And it was because of these for-profit corporations, because two things happened. Everybody talks about the guilds and the masters and the apprentices, but it was pretty much big families and mom and dad teaching their kids. The kids were the apprentices, and moms were starting as many companies. I don't know if it was as many companies as dads, but many of, and women were literate. I mean, it was a period of time that the enemies of the church had to, kind of obliterate and rewrite. Back to your question, when the Franciscans are spreading all over Europe, they got to build friaries. Where's the money coming for that? So the vocations are coming from those families, because when a young child is working with mom or dad's ecclesiastical venture enterprise, they get to be about 14 or 15, and they say, gosh, we love working in this farm. It's so great. But we love the prayer life more than anything. So some of the kids became friars or poor clares. So now you have an abundance of vocations, and you have all the money to build all those friaries all throughout Europe. And that's how Christendom was established.
Because effectively, you're like you mentioned the example of the CEO maybe taking 90 and the VP of sales taking $275,000 salary. But what's also pointed out is that the entire company would take what they need, and then the excesses could be then used for all of those things, right? To be building new schools and everything. And it's just important to recognize that when we sometimes forget this as entrepreneurs, we're doing just our one little thing, right? We tend to think, oh, I can't make that much impact. But it's so powerful when people see charity, when people see people loving each other in a way that just like, there's no reason for me to be so kind to all these strangers, right? And they see that, especially in a world where there is no kindness to each other, it really impacts people. And that's what I think we all need to focus on, is this.
Well,
Even if
yeah,
even
it's like a magnet.
Yeah,
People say, I want that. I want to be in that environment. I want to be with those people. I want to be, because what they're doing is they're experiencing the love of Christ.
exactly.
They're experiencing, and they don't know what to make of it in the beginning. They just want it. And then over the course, they realize, hey, wow, it's Jesus. And then
Yep.
when they recognize that, they convert.
Yep.
But it didn't require a lot of talking, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is why that saying, right? Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words, right? I don't know if that's actually necessarily true, but
Well,
it's
it's
usually
attributed to
attributed
St.
to Saint
Francis,
Francis.
actually,
Yeah,
and they don't know if it's actually
correct.
he said that, but it certainly reflects
Yeah, what you
his
just talked about.
spirituality, because different than the Dominicans that were preaching. Not to say that the Franciscans weren't powerful preachers, because at that time they were, and they were fully engaged with these consecrated religious Franciscan corporations of that time. That's why when you go to Florence and you're standing at the front door of this little teeny church on Via Scialoia or whatever, and you go, wow, there's another little church. I could probably hit the front door if I threw a stone at it. And they're built around the same time. And you go, well, why didn't they just build a bigger church? Because each one was associated with some ecclesiastical enterprise or some community, right?
Mm,
So there's an acre or two, and they build a little church, and they're doing work, and they have buildings where the companies are operating, and the friars are rolling up their sleeves. They were heavily involved with what was going on and providing all the spiritual direction and discernment. And because the focus again was always on their salvation.
yeah. So let's go through some of the characteristics. So we understand the purpose of the ecclesiastical venture. We've kind of got some ideas of what it looks like. Let's go through a little bit. We'll go through rapidly through these characteristics of what it would look like. We talked about the pay already. So it's like you pay people what they need for their particular family. It sounds like it's not based off of, oh, I'm the CEO, so I get more. It's based off of my family's needs. Is that correct?
Yeah, and this is where the spiritual directors are so important, because every person is unique and their situations are unique. And when the devil can't get you to do something like wrong because he sees, well, that's a great, boy, darn, they're using that money to do the work of God, and they're willing to live a frugal life, right? Then he pushes them really hard in that direction. So now this manager is saying, well, Father, I think we only need $150,000 a year, and we can do it. He goes, no, no, no. You've got 8 kids. One of them just got accepted to a really great Catholic program, Catholic university or college. And on $150,000, you can't afford that. And because you could earn far more in the secular world, you need to earn what is appropriate so you can pay for your child's education and not take the scholarship away from someone else who will never have the earning capacity you have. So even determining the salary requires this kind of discernment so we don't make a mistake in the wrong direct, in the right direction, but excessive to where
Yeah.
it's a
The
mistake
burden.
also.
Yeah, of course,
Right,
of course.
right.
So then, so we've talked about that. Now, what about who can be in the business? You mentioned earlier people of goodwill. This is not just for Catholics, like this is for everybody?
That's right. Well, the corporation is structured as a religious corporation. So you describe the purpose as my sons and I have with the company we started recently. And the purpose is the salvation of souls according to the dogmas and doctrines, teachings of the Catholic faith. So we define that's its purpose. And then you write the bylaws and the articles of incorporation to define things like what a person of goodwill is. You don't have to be a 501c3 or what 508, I guess, is religious. You can define everything about it as being religious. And so you operate as a Catholic entity the way a Catholic parish or parochial school does. And they define kind of what a person of goodwill is. So, for example, what do Catholic parish schools do? They'll accept anybody of goodwill to come there, but they make it very clear. You can't come in there and start pushing and saying, forget about Easter, Kwanzaa, I'm all about that. And they try to convince others. The principal is going to sit down with the parents and child and say, you can't do this here. And if it continues, you're going to have to leave. And not even the ACLU will defend that family.
Yeah.
Because that's the way it's structured. So same thing here. Basically, what you're saying is you can't have a problem with the Catholic Church. You can't be some kind of bigot or whatever. And that's basically most people. It really is. And in
Yeah.
fact, when many countries were taken over by communism, they were taken over by a very small percentage, like 2 or 3% in key places. And all the people of goodwill, next thing you know, find themselves under this horrible system. But the people of goodwill are still there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, I think this is a really key point. Just to bring this again, even if somebody's not building an ecclesiastical venture nowadays, just the principle that again, we're not, we should be working with everybody because we can then be witnesses to those people, right? It's not like we cannot be exclusive. And I think, I especially am critical of sometimes seeing parishes that are very, very rigorous in their faith, but they're very close to any outsiders ever coming in. Anybody who seems like they might be of the world and they're not willing to let them in and be part of the community or at least experience it to then have that conversion. So I won't
Yeah,
go
yeah.
too
I don't know
much.
if I would use the term everybody. It's a tough question, but if you think of the early church, people didn't even know where the sacrifice of the Mass was occurring unless they were vetted.
Hmm.
Nowadays, I know where I live, I've seen Satanists come in there to steal the Eucharist when they went up for communion. And they had to be stopped. And there's like 3 satanic groups. They do it all the time. And actually, the church says, digressing a little, communion in the hand should cease as soon as that's verified, right? So being open to everybody, I think is not correct either. In fact, Jesus and in the church uses the word goodwill all the time because a person of ill will,
Yeah,
clearly define
yeah,
themselves as an enemy of the church.
of course.
And we don't have to work with them. We don't have to collaborate with people of ill will. In fact, even St. Paul spoke about that, you encounter someone like that, be charitable, but you don't like roll up your sleeves and what's your perspective?
Yeah.
What's mine?
Yeah, no, that is true. It is. He mentions that quite a few times. So a couple other ones that we've already talked about is it sounds like anytime there's a dispute, you have the spiritual director get involved for the daily prayer schedule. It sounds like mass and all of the office and maybe other things, but really integrating this into the daily schedule. There's no hey we have to cancel prayer today because there's deliveries need
That's
to be made.
exactly right.
And then the objective. This part I want to get your take on a little bit more. So we're not here just to make money. Like we're probably doing something, producing some good and making money, but our primary objective is not return on investment. It's a heavenly return on investment, basically. So how do they manage that? Like do they just put the prayer structure in and say, hey, we're going to spend the rest of the time that we do have to make our product and to deliver this and to make money so that we can pay for all these salaries, et cetera? Like how do they manage that?
These corporations worked in many respects just like any corporation. There's the term quality control that's used today. Well, quality control back then came from the fact that the workmanship was done so extremely well because that's how they showed reverence to God, right? By doing making the best use of the gifts that God had given them, not being wasteful, not being is that word slothful or whatever, and doing things in a certain way. And then when they took over the guilds, they baked it right into the operations of all of these religious corporations. I think it's worth mentioning that, there's this principle of divine economy, right? You see this, it's very commonplace within religious orders. A perfect example of this is when the Daughters of Charity got involved in healthcare, 100 and some years ago. The Mother Superior, who was the foundress and doing all this, she spent, 3-4 hours a day working on growing a healthcare network that was growing and growing and growing. And she spent 8 hours a day praying, slept like a baby. Her 42-year-old counterpart, secular hospital CEO, is on his second heart attack, works 80 hours a week, never sees his kids, and things are getting accomplished in this religious corporation, because it was a religious corporation, in maybe days or weeks, where the secular counterpart is taking months or it never gets done. Right. And so now all religious orders, because they're faithful to the rule of their order, are any of them that get involved in any kind of enterprise are operating this way, all of them, because prayer always comes first. So there's just no reason why the laity can't do the same thing. And that was the question to Francis 800 years ago. And he gave him a rule,
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay, so then a couple other ones there would be this idea of, I had framed it differently, but you mentioned it earlier. They use a lot of this excess capital to build schools, to build hospitals. So I kind of, in today's terms, you would kind of call that impact investing, right? So a lot of people
right.
nowadays, especially when people have achieved financial success, Catholic entrepreneurs, they get into this world where like, hey, how can I continue to increase my wealth? They are generous in many cases, but they're still looking at things from a perspective of, hey, over here I can get 10% ROI on an annual basis, or over here I might get 20 with the private equity markets, right? But thinking about it in this perspective that, hey, we're trying to do these things for the benefit of all mankind and we're building these projects. So I don't want to go any deeper into that one. But
No, you're raising a great point. You're raising a really great point, because those Franciscans weren't concerned with that at all. And in fact, what they did is, as more wealth was created, they tithed more. In fact, it's a very interesting fact that J.C. Penney, who was not Catholic, but he went through a crisis and then became, I guess, something like maybe a fundamentalist or evangelical Christian, right? So he was like contemplating suicide. Things were really bad. He turns his life around, and because he was impacted by these Christians that he heard in the sanatorium where he was, they're praying and singing on the floor up above, and he felt kind of good hanging out with them. So he becomes a Christian. So he starts off tithing, and he was his wealthiest when he was tithing 90%. So what does this prove? It proves what we're all taught as Catholics. You're never going to outdo God in generosity. Well, when God sees that you're so detached from this stuff, he knows he can entrust you to do the right things with his wealth, right? So the more selfless and detached that you become, the more he entrusts you with this wealth. This is why with Nicodemus Ventures, and we're kind of in the formation stages right now, and hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to fund those that are willing to operate their companies. And we can tell pretty quickly if someone says, we're doing this work like pro bono right now. If someone says, yeah, I want to live this way, and I'm in a position to start my own company, and so help me out. And so there are some conditions. I said the first thing you're going to do is you're going to tithe 20%. And it's going to grow from there, and you're going to love it, and you're going to experience a joy and contentment because of this that you can't experience any other way, right? And they get this, and they want it. So it's not like that's the most important thing. And then, of course, we say, look, you have to be a Catholic that embraces all the dogmas and doctrines of the faith, because if you're not in a state of grace, as I mentioned before, this isn't going to work. You might think you're doing the will of God and all that, but you're actually, like Father Ripperger, the famous exorcist, says, when you're not in a state of grace, the devil can just jerk your chain and manipulate you and move you around as he pleases. And of course, in most instances, he's going to do it in a way that you're not even aware of.
Mm-hmm.
So people might be saying what a great person you are, and you're doing all this philanthropic work. By the way, many of the secular companies, after they destroyed the religious corporations, and the only mention today of religious corporations, are always tied to religious orders. They're not tied to, and of course, third order Franciscans tied to a religious order, but they don't talk about the lay version, if we would call it that, right? The third order
Yeah.
versions.
Interesting. Okay. So then,
But the secular companies copied them. So next thing you know, when they want to kind of reframe or copy the successful ones, right? This happened with hospitals, schools. The secular counterparts will come along and then they'll ape the Catholic version. They will copy the Catholic version. So then they have their charities. The big corporation all have their charities they support because they want to look good and philanthropic. And I don't want to be cynical, and I don't want to say they're not doing it because they genuinely believe in these things, but it's kind of expected almost because they want to maintain their good PR and publicity, so their motivations are different.
yeah, understood. So then I guess the last couple things on the characteristics would be, we talked about the spiritual director and chaplain. What about a community center? I think you mentioned this to me in the past. Like, did they typically have like an actual communal space that they would kind of invest in, or was that just kind of like table stakes to build one of these things? How did
Well, when they formed the confraternities, they did. When they formed the confraternities, they either built or acquired, a space. And hey, we're going to be meeting there. They could certainly have a large enough corporation where they could have space where they could do it there. So it wasn't so much where, but yeah, the funding for the confraternities came from the
Got it.
corporations.
Okay, got it. So then let's talk about this in terms of today. Like, how could we bring these things back? So, what in your mind are the core components required to see these come again? So, like, we need in basics principles like money. We need people. What are the core things?
Okay, so you could go to ecclesiasticalenterprises.com, and at the bottom, there's I think it's the link that says overview, and there's a template. So a template has been written which gives a basic explanation of how an ecclesiastical enterprise is structured. And depending upon what the activity is, right? It could be an LLC or an S Corp or a C Corp or a limited partnership, but they're all going to have a spiritual director. And this is kind of um, a tough thing. In fact, maybe I need to provide a little more clarity there. I think in many instances, a spiritual director is different than a spiritual advisor. Spiritual director is usually the confessor for the person. So they're getting to really know that person intimately, right? And they're not making the decisions for them, but they're pointing out what's going on in their life, major sins maybe that they're dealing with. So that's one level. I think that it's very possible, and perhaps in some instances, I haven't got enough research on this, the friar may have just been a spiritual advisor. Does that make sense? So they really were good friends with the founder of this corporation 800 years ago, but maybe that founder went to a different priest for confession. But the spiritual advisor for the corporation was very inspired by what they were doing. And so they were praying for the corporation, right? That's very important. When Maximilian Kolbe with 800 friars in Neapocolano are pumping out pamphlets and books and are like a major publishing house, right? When all of a sudden all the printing presses stop working, they didn't call the mechanics in. He said everybody into the chapel, and they prayed. And next thing you know, the equipment's working again. Because what happens in an ecclesiastical enterprise, and by the way, this happens with anybody who's very serious about their faith, they go from the ordinary level, right, to the extraordinary level, to the miraculous level, right? That's true for everyone. So the saints exhausted all ordinary means to do the will of God, the extraordinary means. So what's left? God has to do these miraculous things through them. And now what happens when you're dealing with the attacks that come, and you've probably even known people like this. I've spoken to many Catholic men that got together with some other Catholic men and said, hey, we've got the means and the money. Let's start this company together. And they face ordinary problems and they resolve those, and then some extraordinary problems. And then all of a sudden they're dealing with preternatural problems, where Father Rippergood would say, you may be dealing with demonic oppression here because there's a pattern, right? And of course, the devil doesn't want to show his hand. What he wants to do is just to get these guys so frustrated to just say, wow, we're spending all this money. We don't know why things aren't working out. What do we do? And ultimately, and again, I know many have gone through this, they go back to their secular jobs because they got to pay bills, right? So this addresses your question. You have a spiritual director You consecrate yourself and your business. You have a patron saint, and that patron saint is prayed to every day, and their intercession is requested every day, right? And you have the prayer regimen. Now, does it have to be a third order? No, I don't believe so. This is kind of my personal opinion, I suppose, because 800 years ago, they were all tied to those religious orders. But I believe that, as many friars, even friars told me, God just wants us to pray more. Father Calloway has said that, just pray, try to find a way to pray more. So I believe if managers did the Angelus, and did a full rosary, divided up throughout the day, and stuck to it, like you and I were talking about before, it doesn't get sacrificed at any cost. It doesn't matter what's going on. Now, there's going to be instances where, if everybody who wants to goes into the chapel at the specific hours, there could be a manager who does have to do something that everyone would understand needs to be addressed, and so they go and they do that. Right? Like one priest told me, sometimes when you're in prayer and the doorbell rings, sometimes you do have to get up and answer it. I spent 5 days with some Eastern Rite monks, and there's like 12 monks, and one of the monks was an executive chef, and a bunch of people were coming over that day. So he wasn't there for specific prayer because he had to be in the kitchen doing things. So that happens, it's not so rigid and so, right? It's reasonable and practical too. But, if there's a panic because something really bad is going on, and it's a early stage company where there's traction and they're making money, but now there's a crisis and everybody decides to skip the prayer, that's bad, because that's a big message to God that you don't trust him first and foremost.
Yeah,
You don't.
I think it's super important. Something I was going to comment on earlier is that all of these things, when you approach it from this perspective, they're just basically requiring you to put your trust in God first, right? And I think there's something that a lot of people say, "Oh, I trust God," but yet they then fail to act that way, right? And doing so, and putting your time and your calendar with God first and heaven first, you are choosing to truly trust in God, right?
And you're demonstrating it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because most of those people would say, "Oh yes, of course. Oh, I always put God first and all." But we have to be careful when we say these things. And I'm speaking for myself as well, because God can test us at a level that makes it evident, or makes it seem like we never did believe in those things to begin with. I mean, when you look at the dark night of the soul of many saints, the little flower who is starting to have some doubts about God because she is in such a profound state of darkness. So, it's by the grace of God. Everything is grace. And that's what happens within an ecclesiastical enterprise, is people begin to see it. They begin to witness it. Wow, we needed this money. We needed this connection. And somebody out of the blue called the manager and said, "Hey, I got this thing, and would you guys be interested in blah?" And it's the answer to the prayer. And there's no logical networking explanation or any effort that was done that brought that solution. That happened with Mother Angelica, for example, all the time.
yeah. So if I were to try to recap this, then, so it sounds like there's four things that you mentioned. So number one, to have this ecclesiastical enterprise, you need a spiritual director and spiritual advisor. So it's kind of perhaps two separate roles there for the
No,
founder.
no, no. It would be one or the other.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that's for the founder. You need somebody, obviously, a founder who's willing to do this. Then you need to consecrate yourself and the business to God, and then you need a patron saint, and you need to build in a prayer routine or a prayer regimen to the business. Those are the core components. Is that correct, or are there anything else that you'd add
But
there?
pretty much. I mean, the tithing is critical. It really is, because everything's a gift from God. And, he's trying to get us to be like St. Joseph. I was glad you invoked his name. He was a lover of poverty. It was not like he was just, "Oh, things are tough and we'll get by." Oh, no, he was completely, obviously the Blessed Mother was, living on divine providence. I mean, there were instances, probably more than anyone in human history, that were living literally in the moment to moment, not knowing where the food was going to come from, how to purchase things that were needed for baby Jesus. God wants us to fully depend upon him. And
Yeah.
that's a pretty big
It's very difficult.
demand.
It's very difficult for many men today because there's a lot of critique against men who don't prepare. and how to provide for their family. And then there's the people who take it too extreme. They say, "Oh, like, oh, I can't manage starting my own business because it's just too risky, right? I won't be able to. Who knows how I'll be able to provide, right?" And I
Can
think
I
that,
comment on that? Because that's a
yeah, of
very,
course.
very good point. That's a great point. I have something I could send you, which is it's a program for homeschooling families. And homeschooling families are perfect for this because, let's say they've got a number of children and there's a seventh or eighth grader who has some, God gives everybody, pretty much everybody, but there's always within a family somebody that has all sorts of great ideas for businesses. That's like always the case. And so the father or mother says, hey, we ought to think about doing this. Well, they don't have to just like jump ship from their corporate life. They could say, hey, in the evening, instead of playing games or you're watching television and us doing whatever, we're going to spend an hour and a half thinking about what we could do as a family business. And they involve everybody. And if they start that little business, even the 5 or 6 year old can be doing some cleanup work and they love having these chores and doing these things and feeling like they contributed. And one quick little example, they weren't Catholic, but they were brother and sister, homeschooled during the first Iraqi war. Father was an accountant. Mother, I forget if she had what other expertise other being the primary teacher. And the brother and sister were touched by the fact that the Iraqi soldiers could not communicate with their families, but that an AT&T had a program, turn in those old cell phones and we'll give you calling cards. So they wanted to collect used cell phones, get the calling cards, and then have them sent to the soldiers. Well, they kind of operated it, I think, in a very similar way. Today, they have the number one cell phone recycling business in the United States of America, but it was the number one before they were out of high school. They were like ninth and 10th graders. By the time she's a senior and he's a junior, they both had like full boat scholarships from MIT, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, all the Ivy thrown at them, right? But it was being led this way because they were inspired and their objectives were not about profit. They could care less about making money. They wanted to help these soldiers. It was a pure act of charity.
It's perhaps worth noting here that my perspective on all these examples that you've always mentioned is that if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to start a business to make money, and that's primarily the objective, I'm just going to make money, then you're kind of approaching it from the wrong perspective. Whereas if you believe that you have some sort of mission or something that you feel called to do, if you discern that, hey, God has put this on my heart and I want to move towards it. That's, again, not saying that you have to just jump ship and do something crazy and have no income for your family and just put it in God's hands. But you can begin to put the effort into building this thing on the side, doing it with your family, get them involved. We could comment on the aspect of getting children involved. I would be curious about that. But the principle is you must approach it first from a perspective of doing good for others, doing something positive for others. It's not about you just thinking, how can I replace my income and do it my way? Because then it's all very self-focused. It
Well, number
has to be
one
others
is
focused.
is praising God, is living a penitent lifestyle within the work environment, right? You want to pray more. You want to work out your salvation. And of course, our number one obligation is like, Catechism 101 is we need to be focused on our own salvation first. And then, of course, when you're married, you're focused on your spouse's salvation. They're focused on your salvation. Then you're focused on your children's. And as you start to build from there, it just starts to spread and spread and spread, right? It gets multiplied. It's like the more you spend love or give out love, the more you get to give out, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, last thing that we're gonna have to cover here because we're out of time is what is the first step in getting these things built again? Like in your perspective, what you're doing right now with Nicodemus Ventures, like how can we get these to be built again? Is it just about finding another entrepreneur and convincing them to really think about this in their hearts? Do we need
Well,
money? Like what do we need?
Well, somebody could reach out to me at Mark at nicodemusventures.org and you spell it just like it sounds. Just make sure there's an S on the end, nicodemusventures.org. And they can ask me directly and I can point them to resources or send them resources. I use the Found app, Phound, because it's private and secure and unlike something like Zoom. And I'm currently advising some people through that. But in terms of how we expect this to kind of explode, the big picture for Nicodemus Ventures is actually build these Catholic communities. Catholic mixed-use planned unit developments. Okay. So a planned unit development, or like one of the early, in Florida, there's a place called Seaside, and it's a community like built from scratch, right? Beautiful place. It's secular, but it's a wonderful place. And it's kind of like rebuilding the Italian hill town. But when you build this town, or this village, it's also operated as an ecclesiastical enterprise, and it too is consecrated. And you allow people of goodwill to live in this community as well. But here's what it has that makes it unique, and I believe is unstoppable for the reestablishment of Christendom. Where are faithful Catholics moving? They're moving to places like Clear Creek Abbey, where the Benedictines are, out in Missouri, where the nuns are, right, where Sister Wilhelmina is, I guess, is. There's hubs, right, and faithful Catholics, whether traditional Latin Mass and other sort of faithful Catholics, they want to be in these environments. Well, there's a very interesting characteristic of all of them. They're all next to like these rural towns where everybody is like leaving, right? The young people go away, they never come back. And all of them have a major economic development problem. So when you build a Catholic community like this, and the Catholic community has an incubator, and it's helping all the families that are there, of those that want to, start their own ecclesiastical venture enterprise, the incubator does what all incubators do. So if, 3 to 5 companies are being formed every year, those companies, especially if they're manufacturing based and have a product that needs a ton of those widgets, they're going to be going in and leasing all those abandoned brick buildings in every one of these rural communities. What that does is the rural communities are going to love you. Now, are there still going to be people that hate you? Sure, but they're going to keep quiet because they're going to lose their job on the county commission or planning board when 80% of all the people of goodwill go, hey, listen, this Catholic community, they're not keeping anybody of goodwill from living there. They're treating everyone really well. In fact, they're doing all, and hey, this is our economic development dream come true. Who could possibly be against this? And so this is replicatable. I don't know, replicable or whatever. Yeah. And so I've identified a system. There's a system in Italy to build these communities on large scale. I've known the founder for 40 some years. And they did that 800 years ago. If they didn't build a hilltop town, right, in Italy, they took over one of these old medieval villages. And that's why when you go to any of these Italian hill towns, what do you find on the piazza? The church, the thing, all the same elements. And it's funny because all people of goodwill who go to Italy and other places in Europe, and they go to these hill town villages, they love it because it's at a scale where everyone can get to know one another and care about one another. And when things get to be too big, right, then the anonymous phenomena begins to happen, and people don't care as much about people that they don't know or have some connection to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's so many things we've covered today. I really appreciate your research that has gone into this and understanding how we can build these because I am very bought into this idea. I think there are a lot of Catholic entrepreneurs I've met who are still hesitant. Let's say that at the a very charitable way to say it, and it's just because we're not familiar with it. We don't have this vocabulary. We haven't talked about things in this nature, at least in the terms of business. It's always got that capitalistic mindset of like, hey, first thing you have to do is you got to make money to be alive. And it's like, okay, I get that, but we're also forgetting about the fact as Catholics that God will take care of us, right? We're not being presumptuous and saying, oh yeah, God's going to do everything. It's like we are putting our focus first on the spiritual, and we use our brain, we use our skills that God gave us to do business well. It's not like we just say, hey, I'm gonna, go do something completely crazy and expect people to want it. You do the normal things. You discover, is there a need for this product in the market? Does it have product market fit in general? And then you do the things that you have the skills to do because God gave them to you, gave you a brain.
Right.
And then you put God first. You put the
That's the
religious
key.
life
You
first.
see, that's the thing that people will say. People often say, I put God first, but when you look really closely, they're not trusting God at the level that they probably would like to, right? Yeah. So this idea that you trust God to provide for you and the thing you focus on is worshiping him, praying and all that. That's not an easy thing. And what will happen is the stakes will get raised even within an ecclesiastical enterprise because God tests us. right? If we're saying, hey, we want to be detached from things, he's going to give us opportunities to demonstrate that we're detached. Patience is a famous example, right? Lord, make me more patient. Well, what does he do? Next thing you know, you're facing all these situations where patience is being tried. Well, that's the way it has to be,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, what is it? What is it? Please, Lord, give me patience and hurry.
Right.
But anyways, Mark, this has been a pleasure having you on. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
And then just one last time, can you mention the website where people can reach out or learn more about Ecclesiastical Ventures?
Sure, they can just go to nicodemusventures.org. And then when they get to nicodemusventures.org, and we're going to be redoing that, it's a very simple site that looks even very well on a phone. And right at the beginning of the web page, there are links to the ecclesiasticalenterprises.com site, which quickly goes over what we've discussed. And at the bottom, there are additional links to information. And again, of course, anyone can email me at mark@nicodemusventures.org. And then if they want to, join some others, we're going to be meeting once a week, and I'll just field questions kind of like this
Amazing.
to help people, move in this direction.
Amazing, Mark. Well, I appreciate the work you're doing. I'm excited to hopefully be able to partner with you in some way. I've got some ideas, but we'll be in touch
Great. I look
from
forward
there.
to talking about that. Yeah,
All
we'll
right.
do that.
God bless you.
Wonderful. God bless you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in and learning what an ecclesiastical venture is with our guest, Mark Wilson, today. I'd like to hear from you. What was the most interesting thing that you learned from listening today? And what is one way that you're going to adjust your business going forward based on what you've learned? Also, before we go, please help us to grow the show by sharing this. It's really the only way that we grow, so it means a lot. Send it to a couple friends, share it on social media, whatever works. And finally, if you are looking for a tribe of other faithful builders who are committed to restoring God's kingdom on earth, consider joining the Catholic Founders Guild today. It's an incredible group of over 40 business owners who are striving each day to grow closer to God through their entrepreneurial journeys and figuring out how they can use their gifts and resources to reinsert God into the world. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year, so literally anybody can afford it. We're not trying to get rich off of this. We just want to use it as a way to help fund this project. Just go to catholicfounders.com/subscribe to upgrade today. Okay, see you next time on Catholic Founders.